In this lesson, we're going to cover the basics of configuring OSPF on Arista switches. Because OSPF is such a big topic, we've broken it up into multiple lessons. You can find details for OSPF in Arista's EOS configuration guide and on Arista's EOS Central website. We'll assume you have some experience with OSPF, so we won't go into a deep dive of OSPF-related RFCs. Arista's implementation of OSPF is industry standard. Arista supports both OSPF version 2 and OSPF version 3. This lesson focuses on OSPF version 2. Arista's supported features for OSPF version 2 include a single OSPF version 2 instance, intra and inter-area routing, external routing including type 1 and type 2, point-to-point interfaces, as well as broadcast type interfaces, stub areas, not so stubby areas, which is NSSA as defined in RFC 3101, authentication, and route redistribution including BGP and static routes. Arista's OSPF implementation provides the industry standard operations that you would expect, such as single area, multiple area, ABRs, area border routers, and ASBRs, autonomous system boundary routers. In all of the OSPF lessons, we're going to leverage a lab of 5 switches. And let me show you a picture of the lab just so you can have a mental reference. So here we have 5 switches, each of which are in area 0, except for switch 5, which we'll use in area 51. All the interfaces are IP'd for us already, and all the switches have OSPF configured and running except for switch 1. We'll focus the bulk of our configuration examples by configuring OSPF on switch 1. So on switch 1, let's enable OSPF. The first thing we need to do is get into configuration mode, type config, enter, and then IP routing is not enabled by default. So if you haven't turned it on yet, the command is IP space routing, enter. And then for OSPF, router space OSPF space, and then we'll enter a question mark where it's asking for the process ID. So we'll just use a process ID of 1. The process ID is only locally significant to our switch. If we use a question mark here, you can see we have a bunch of options to configure for OSPF. To get the neighbor relationship started, we need to enable OSPF on our interface Ethernet 3 and interface Ethernet 4, and we do that with our network statements. So we're going to enter network space, and then Ethernet 3 is 172.16.200.1/30, and then we need an area command, area 0. And then interface Ethernet 4 is network 172.16.200.5/30, and we'll also put that in area 0. Notice for now that I'm placing these interfaces in area 0, which is the backbone area. And notice that I used the exact address of the interface. So we always want to verify our configuration. We can do that with multiple commands, including show run section OSPF, enter. And there you can see our router OSPF1, our 2 network statements tied to area 0, and a max LSA that's put in there for us by default. Notice the network statements look a little different than the commands I entered. I entered 200.1/30 and 200.5/30. The switch automatically corrected that to the appropriate network statement, which is 200.0 and 200.4. Now let's take a look at our OSPF interfaces. So I'm going to get out of configuration mode by typing end, and then we can issue the command show IP OSPF interface, enter. And you can see we have 2 interfaces associated to OSPF, our Ethernet 3 and our Ethernet 4. And notice that the OSPF network type is broadcast. You can see that here on Ethernet 3 and on Ethernet 4. And yes, these are Ethernet interfaces, but I have the switches directly connected to one another. So rather than them running as broadcast networks, I want to change that to an OSPF network type of point-to-point. And we do that in interface configuration mode. So we'll type config, enter, interface Ethernet 3, enter, and then IP OSPF network point dash to dash point. Enter. And we'll do that for interface Ethernet 4 as well. Interface Ethernet 4, IP OSPF network point to point. Enter. And then we want to reissue the command for verification, show IP OSPF interface. Enter. And now we can see both Ethernet 3 and Ethernet 4 have been changed to a network type of point-to-point. This command also provides useful information about our timers for the hello and dead intervals and our neighbor count. So let's take a look at our OSPF neighbors. We can do that with the command show IP OSPF neighbor. Enter. And we can see that we have two neighbors, a neighbor ID of 172.16.0.3 and another one at 0.4. And those are our neighbors switch 3, which is the 0.3, and switch 4, which is the 0.4. You can see both are in our default VRF. They have a default priority of 0. The state is full for both. We also have a dead timer that if we issue the up arrows multiple times, we'll see the dead timer counts down while we wait for hello packets to refresh that timer. And then we can see the IP address on the neighbor and the associated interface. Since we already have OSPF configured on the other switches in this lab, let's see if we're learning any OSPF routes. We can do that in two ways. We can simply type show IP route, enter, and look at the output and see that we do have several OSPF routes with the O and the OIA keywords. O meaning OSPF intra-area routes, and then OIA telling us that those are OSPF inter-area routes. We could also issue the command show IP route OSPF just to focus on the OSPF learned routes. And in this lab, that excludes our connected interfaces. And notice also in the output, we can see the OSPF administrative distance, which is a default of 110, and we can see our OSPF interface cost. We can see our OSPF link state database with the command show IP OSPF database, enter. We don't have a lot going on yet, but we can see the link IDs and advertising routers among a few other things. And since we do have one switch, switch 5, in another area, which is area 51, we have two switches that are acting as ABRs, or area border routers. So let's take a look at who those switches are. And we'll use the command show IP OSPF border dash routers, enter. And by looking at the router IDs, I can tell that we're correctly seeing switch 3, which is the 172.16.0.3, and switch 4, 172.16.0.4, as the ABRs. And they're ABRs because they're connected to area 0, as well as connected to area 51, with the neighbor relationship to switch 5. There are several more topics to dive into with OSPF, so we'll stop here for now, and that'll conclude our lesson on the basic configuration of OSPF on Arista switches.